Hello. My name is Paul Williams. I am the founder and president of Project HEURISTIC, a New Jersey nonprofit corporation. I want to talk with you today a little bit about Project HEURISTIC, but mostly about why and how I came to create it. Because I believe that knowing and understanding that part of the backstory of Project HEURISTIC will help more people also know and understand how important it is and could be as a tool to reduce criminal recidivism, reduce the cycle of crime, and ultimately increase safety and security in our communities. This is going to be quite a long presentation, so I thank you in advance for your generous time and attention. Now for starters, the word heuristic, spelled H-E-U-R-I-S-T-I-C, originates from the Greek language and loosely translated into English means to find. It is often used in the context of referring to methods of problem solving, such as trial and error. And Project HEURISTIC is precisely just that, a method for problem solving. For today's purposes, it is used in the context of methods to address and resolve the problem of criminal recidivism primarily, and crime generally. The word heuristic is also used for today's purposes as an acronym, helping ex-offenders by uniting resources and information for successful transitions into communities. Heuristic. Against that backdrop, I submit to you that Project HEURISTIC endeavors primarily to reduce criminal recidivism by uniting resources and information that is pertinent to the various needs of currently and formerly incarcerated and court-involved men and women who are, notwithstanding what many think and say dismissively about them, interested in living law-abiding and productive lives. This also includes providing resources and information to the families and loved ones of those men and women, as well as information to other members of the community and professionals, so as to enable interested and concerned persons to be better informed and equipped to appropriately address and resolve the problems of criminal recidivism and crime in general. And it is very important to note that all of this is not only for the benefit of men and women who have committed crime or may commit crime. I say it is very important because I am all too familiar with what I'll kindly refer to as intellectually challenged comments and arguments that constantly come up in and around my community about coddling criminals, being soft on criminals, what we really should do to criminals, and other similar sorts of things that demonstrate the ever-present limit on knowledge and understanding of, or interest in, the cause of much of the crime and recidivism that plagues our communities. The ridiculousness of those comments and arguments, particularly as they completely defy informed logic, always remind me of how it is all too often tempting and easy to talk tough about and exact tough responses to crime and recidivism. The absolute fact is that history and data has more than abundantly revealed that since the so-called tough on crime and war on drugs politically flamed rhetoric and policies began about 50 years ago, we have not been able to arrest and incarcerate our way out of crime and recidivism. And also the financial and human cost of it to taxpayers, victims, offenders, families, and communities has exponentially grown to incredible levels, with little to no benefit to anyone. Think about that. I'll say it again. Little to no benefit to anyone. The simply tough on crime and war on drugs reaction has not restored anyone or anything to the pre-crime condition, and has not itself produced any measurable reduction in the rate of crime or recidivism. I'll say that again too. Has not itself produced any measurable reduction in the rate of crime or recidivism. It's been practically meaningless, and in so many ways extremely expensive, even far beyond simply financial considerations. So with that in mind, a component of Project HEURISTIC also seeks to provide meaningful information to the general public as well. This is so that we are all better informed and equipped as we view issues, consider realistic and effective responses, and voice ourselves to our families, friends, neighbors, and public officials. The benefit of this is the increase in the potential for us all to get on and stay on the same page. If nobody else, innocent people and our communities benefit from assisting currently and formerly incarcerated and court-involved men and women. Project HEURISTIC strives to prevent crime and recidivism, instead of simply continuing to leave it to law enforcement and our criminal justice system to only respond to after the fact. Now, when I say I am the founder and president of Project HEURISTIC, and I describe generally what Project HEURISTIC is, I want to be very, very clear about something. I know that it all sounds really good, and at least on the surface looks really good, and may even be considered admirable. But even I will say that the reality is there is truly much more to be desired of the adequacy, effectiveness, and meaningfulness of my work in this effort. You see, Project HEURISTIC, incorporated in May of 2012, was something that I first had a concept of many years earlier, about 11 years earlier, 2001. And I had gotten the idea for the acronym from a teacher back then. It was never something that I believed I was at all really equipped to establish and build on my own. But I knew and understood back in 2001 just how invaluable some information, some resources could have been and could be to assist currently and formerly incarcerated and court-involved men and women, to reduce the likelihood of recidivism, and how nothing of the sort existed in my home area of Ocean County, New Jersey. I first publicly spoke about the need for prisoner reentry assistance 18 years ago, in December of 2002, at a forum on poverty before the Ocean County Board of Freeholders. I begged that something be done. I asked not that extra money be doled out, but from whatever money may be allocated to deal with the issue of poverty in Ocean County, that some of that money be specifically earmarked to assist the currently incarcerated men and women who are returning to our communities. My appearance and some of my comments was memorialized in a December 4th, 2002 article in the Asbury Park Press. Over the next 10 years, no public or private agency in Ocean County had taken up any notable effort to address the need for assistance to these men and women. Instead, an exorbitant amount of taxpayer money was continued to be used to simply respond to, instead of prevent, recidivism, and regardless of the fact that a fraction of that taxpayer money could have been used more efficiently to prevent recidivism and the further ever-increasing exorbitant expenditure of taxpayer funds on after-the-fact responses by law enforcement, prosecutors, the judiciary, the jails, and the prisons. And this is to say nothing of preventing the untold numbers of additional victims of crime. So, having some idea of how to incorporate a business, and perhaps suffering with some delusional expectation that a thing like Project HEURISTIC would become of interest and supported by public officials and heads of private entities, I formally incorporated Project HEURISTIC in May of 2012. Delusional or not, my expectation proved to be wrong. In fact, no public official or head of any private entity ever expressed an interest in what I was trying to do or in doing it on their own. I have since realized, from considering the explosive growth of the drug treatment industry since 2010, that the main reason for the lack of interest was simply because prisoner reentry services was not lucrative. And regardless of the fact that preventing recidivism and crime is much more cost efficient. Unlike the drug treatment industry, there is no money to be made in prisoner reentry services. Drug treatment, on the other hand, had become big business, estimated to be a $42 billion industry. And this is a result of the 2010 enactment of the Affordable Care Act, more commonly known as Obamacare, which required drug treatment to be paid for by and through Medicaid for poor people, and for people who can afford their own insurance by private insurance companies. The drug treatment industry, however, is a whole other topic. Back to prisoner reentry assistance. With or without having incorporated Project HEURISTIC, I did the work. I spent countless amounts of time and energy with men and women and their families and loved ones who have needed help, searching for resources and information for housing, food, clothing, basic hygiene necessities, getting identification, employment, transportation, mental health, etc. How to navigate the systems and the bureaucracies that possessed any resources. Driving men and women to appointments and jobs. Collecting and distributing necessities. And attempting to guide these men and women and their families and loved ones through the difficult feelings and emotions when there was no resources or when access to them was unattainable. And to cope with the reality of being in this environment of freedom versus the environment of incarceration. And I did it without any pay or conditions. And often while I myself desperately needed help. I have been doing what I can to assist at-risk men and women to find a sense of hope and to inspire them to do better and be better for themselves, for their community, for their families. I've been doing what I can to assist families and loved ones who often do not adequately know and understand what to actually do for their loved one who was incarcerated or formerly or court involved. I have been doing what I can to prevent recidivism. I have been doing what I can to protect innocent people and the community. But the mission of Project HEURISTIC has been an extremely difficult and heavy lift for me. I have known mostly only the realistic and practical needs of the men and women, as well as their families and loved ones, but did not know enough about how to sufficiently grow a nonprofit business or to navigate the politics that are implicit in fundraising from government and even private entities, which is necessary to tap into for the resources or to create the resources that are desperately needed by the men and women and their families and loved ones that I have been concerned with. Ultimately, I was not successful at building the business of Project HEURISTIC and have only done as much of the work as I can under the circumstances. And sadly, I humbly and honestly tell you that it has not been even close to enough. This is why I say there is truly much more to be desired of the adequacy, effectiveness, and meaningfulness of my work in this effort. I have needed and continue to need help. Now, whenever I have spoken privately or publicly about Project HEURISTIC and what I do and have tried to do, I consistently get one particular sort of question. What made you get into this kind of work? I've never heard of anything like this in this area. You see, I'm going to digress for a moment. Ocean County is a largely suburban and rural area, situated along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, and not particularly known for having high rates of crime or having any interest in creative and empathetic methods of dealing with crime and recidivism. But interestingly, as more and more of the children of its more affluent citizens began to be afflicted with the problem of opioid addiction and die from overdoses, there has been an ever-increasing empathy for drug addiction and an interest in creating methods of assisting those who struggle with addiction and the criminal behaviors that accompany it. There is interesting conversations to be had about why that same energy for empathy and creativity didn't exist long before. Like back when there was widespread addiction to crack. But that is also a whole other topic. The answer to the question of what made me get involved in prisoner reentry services, to be fully appreciable, is not necessarily a simple answer. But it does begin with the simple fact that I have been motivated by the realization of how the resources and information for prisoner reentry assistance could have avoided repeated instances of recidivism, victims, an unbelievable expenditure of taxpayer dollars for the arrest, prosecution, and many, many, many years of incarceration of one person in particular, who I have known all his life, but also many other men and women who could have and would have benefited from adequate, effective, and meaningful reentry assistance. The backstory of this one person in particular, I believe, is one of perhaps many perfect examples that there are for the need of the kind of assistance that Project Heuristic endeavors to provide. And I'm going to tell you a bit of his story. In many ways, his story is the sort that is often decried and dismissed as just another sort of sob story of someone with a troubled childhood. That many people have troubled childhoods and don't resort to crime and being a criminal and go on to be successful. How it doesn't justify his criminal behavior. That he should just be responsible. That he should just get a job. If that is your default reaction, and you are unable or unwilling to at least reevaluate it, not even saying to ultimately change it, but to really consider additional information and another perspective and reevaluate it, you may not want to hear the rest of what I'm going to say. But I will assure you now that telling his story is in no way whatsoever even an attempt to justify any of his criminality. Instead, telling his story is simply to give greater perspective and context to small snapshots of his life and to help understand the taxpayer-funded systemic problems that contributed to the creation of those snapshots in his life, and how the failure and refusal to have prisoner reentry assistance contributed to the perpetuation of not just another snapshot of his life, but the creation of another victim of his recidivism. By understanding his story, we can grow to understand that the failure and refusal to have prisoner reentry services left and still leaves innocent people and communities vulnerable and susceptible to avoidable recidivism by him and other similarly situated men and women who desperately want to live law-abiding lives and be productive members of the community, but frankly may not have even a realistic basis to even imagine being able to ever achieve that. And so he and they resort to their own devices and sometimes succeed and oftentimes fail. They know all too often and all too well that many people, for a variety of reasons, will only perceive and treat them as an ex-con, and that their felonies are forever. So telling his story is not at all about making excuses or justification. But instead about the need for us to understand and try to do better. Now his story kind of begins even before he was born. His mother, when she was 15, had run away from home, and during that time had gotten involved with an older man who impregnated her. For reasons unknown, she didn't tell the man she was pregnant, then lost touch, and then decided to give the baby up for adoption when he was born. So when he was born, he was immediately placed with a foster family. For reasons also unknown, she changed her mind several months later. and he was then returned to her. Throughout the next 9 years, he was physically and mentally abused by his mother, who, let it suffice to say, had a bunch of her own personal and unresolved issues. When he was 9 years old, his mother abandoned him to the Division of Youth and Family Services, which was then known as DYFS, and now known as DCP&P. He could tell you that to this day, he still remembers something that happened the morning following the day that DYFS picked him up. He was at what was then known as the County Shelter for JINS. JINS is an acronym for Juveniles in Need of Supervision. He was told he had a phone call and was brought into an office and handed the phone. He said hello. And on the other end, a familiar voice simply said, "Do you want to come home?" It was the voice of his mother. There had been no previous conversations with him about anything that was going on. But instinctively, he immediately responded with a simple but very poignant question. He asked her, "Are you going to hit me anymore?" There was a long silent pause, and then she simply hung up on him. That was the last time he heard anything from or even about his mother for about 3 or 4 years. He was 9 years old. And with no other family, he was essentially abandoned to the custody of the state of New Jersey. He was 9 years old, all but completely alone, and subject to the absolute control and treatment of government officials, and surely bearing indescribable emotions and feelings. Abandoned, perhaps afraid, certainly alone. Who knows? He was not easy to place and keep in any foster home or with any potential adoptive family, due to his being explosively violent, destructive, and generally incorrigible. There was never any clinical diagnosis and certainly no treatment. But his behavior was clearly symptomatic of the fact that he was certainly suffering with serious mental health issues. Now, there is still much to be desired of what is now DCP&P and our current juvenile system. But they are certainly leaps and bounds better than they were back then. Back then, the system was wholly ill-equipped. For instance, and although he was literally a little kid, he was so difficult to handle that resort to the juvenile court process was quickly and often resorted to as a means to incarcerate him in the county juvenile detention center, basically jail for juveniles, and to let the court sort it out. In fact, at 9 years old, he was charged with terroristic threats. He doesn't remember this, but it is a matter of record. So I don't know and cannot even imagine what exactly a 9-year-old, literally little kid, could have said or did that would necessitate his being actually charged with a criminal complaint for terroristic threats. But it happened. And it tends to exemplify how our system, our taxpayer-funded system, handled this 9-year-old little child. It also exemplifies that no one, not one single person, cared enough to care, to protect, to guide, to nurture this little kid. He is believed to have been the youngest person, at the time at least, to ever be admitted to the County Juvenile Detention Center. It's an unenviable distinction to have. He still remembers being handcuffed at that age, and how he was often chained to a 5-point restraint on the wall in his cell. And oh, speaking of a cell, he can still remember what it is like to be that young, locked inside a cell. The sound of the cell door slamming shut, and even the smell. He remembers being that young and subjected to being strip searched and other regimens that are commonly associated with being locked up. He remembers the many foster homes he was in, and how he was treated by foster parents and foster siblings, who all made one consistent thing very clear: he was not family. Where in one foster home, in particular, one of his foster brothers frequently called him a spick and a half-nigger, and where ultimately he was removed after some claim that he had assaulted a younger family member. At this time, he was about 12 years old. He remembers the numerous residential placements he was sent to. One was a state psychiatric facility, where he was admitted after his own suicide attempt while in one of the foster homes. He was 11 years old at that time. He remembers how in the 6 months that he was at that facility, a 20-year-old social work intern sexually molested him numerous times, including her having sexual intercourse with him. He was 11 years old at that time. He remembers how at another place he was charged and ultimately convicted of assaulting a staff member who had actually assaulted him, and he was defending himself. For that, he was sentenced to a term at what was then a New Jersey Department of Corrections facility for younger children in Skillman, New Jersey. Around this time is when his mother unceremoniously popped into his life, basically said hi, and disappeared again. He remembers how when he was about 13, he was at a residential facility out in Mount Holly, New Jersey, where he was nearly suffocated to death by a staff member. He remembers how when he was 16, He was unceremoniously reunited with his mother and sent to live with her. Perhaps underestimated by her, he was not just a young man at that point. He had been a starting varsity athlete on numerous sports. He was very strong, and over the years, through his various placements and experiences, had developed some considerable fighting skills and was no longer simply vulnerable to her or anyone's physical abuse. Completely unbeknownst to him, she didn't want him living with her anymore. And so within about 30 days of his being with her, she had him taken back to the gin shelter. He became aware of this as he returned home one afternoon and found that a police car was in the driveway and an officer was in the house, there to drive him over to the shelter. What to do with him at that point then became an even greater struggle than ever before for Dyfus. Because now he was a bit more intellectually equipped to speak better for himself. But he was still only 16, and therefore the options were limited. After several months, he was ultimately forced out to a residential facility in Pennsylvania, where for about 6 months he lived in a literal teepee in the middle of winter. But more importantly, he was one of the numerous other kids there who had regular physical confrontations with staff. But he had them on a more frequent basis. He was kicked out of that program after one final physical confrontation resulted in his being rendered unconscious. When he returned to New Jersey, physical evidence on his body led to a child abuse investigation at least being initiated. At this point, he was still about 16, but close to 17. Just as before, there was a struggle for Dyfus to find a viable option of what to do with him. In their infinite wisdom, Dyfus intended to simply send him off to some other residential facility, but this time it was out in Wisconsin. He didn't even know where Wisconsin was on a map. He only knew that it was really far away and that he didn't want to go. So he pushed back, and he pushed back hard on the prospect of being simply sent away like that, because nobody wanted him and nobody knew what to do with him. Ultimately, he was essentially allowed, but unofficially, to simply leave the shelter and go out on his own. He was 17 at this time, had no money, nowhere to live, no one to rely on for support, and no idea whatsoever how to support himself and live on his own. But after all he had been through, none of that mattered to him. And he wanted the system to just leave him alone. The system essentially abandoned him again. They offered him no help to make this transition to independence. They would easily spend tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars every year for him to be simply warehoused somewhere until he became a chronological adult and no longer their responsibility, but would do nothing to assist him with housing, food, clothing, or any other basic necessities. And this says nothing about his obvious need for counseling to address and resolve any of the various forms of physical and emotional trauma he had been subjected to his entire life. No guiding hand, no help to develop life management skills, financial literacy, a work ethic. He went on that summer to essentially live on the streets of an Ocean County tourist resort town. I don't know what the big picture of the homelessness issue in that area looked like back then, but I know that it did not appear common for anyone, let alone a 17-year-old, to be homeless in that area around that time. He remembers occasionally sleeping under the boardwalk, but also mingling with vacationers who would have house parties where he would there be able to get some food and maybe be able to crash for the night. And all without anyone knowing the reality of his situation. He wore a practical mask, and behind which he was able to hide the reality of himself and his situation from others. Aimless and confused, he strived to assimilate to what he perceived as normal. Others around his age and in this area had nice cars, jewelry, money, friends, and appeared to be having fun. That was normal. To at least appear to be normal, he believed that he needed those things. He didn't have time, means, even know how to earn those things. In his mind, he just knew that he needed those things, and he desperately needed those things to at least appear to be normal. To keep up the facade that hid the reality of himself and his situation. Somehow, he began to realize that he can simply get those things, or at least some of them, by just taking them, by burglarizing homes and businesses. No doubt he did not respect and abide by the reality that those things belonged to someone else. That someone else may have been gifted those things, earned them, or worked hard for those things. And that it was simply wrong to intrude upon someone else's space and take their things. Yet he still also wanted to be and do better. It was still the summer, and he fully intended to start his senior year of high school that September. He actually used money from one particular burglary to go shopping for school clothes and other necessities so that he could be ready to go back to school in a few weeks. His plan was to finish high school, and as he had wanted to for the past few years, to then go on into the Marine Corps and then go to college. There is a saying that I heard once, and it was so profound that it has always popped back in the forefront of my mind whenever I hear the topic of something in life not going as planned. It is that if you ever want to make God laugh, tell him what your plans are. Because man, God certainly had much different plans than this guy, finishing high school and going on to the Marine Corps. In fact, about a week or two before school was to start, he was arrested for one particular burglary and theft and was held at the Juvenile Detention Center. While there, he and a few others were successful at getting the administration and the powers that be to allow the GED to be proctored there for the first time ever. He passed the GED in that October and was then sentenced and sent to serve a term at what was then another New Jersey Department of Corrections facility for juveniles in Jamesburg. It was the juvenile equivalent of an adult prison. Already having his GED, he was then assigned to work in the facility law library. There, he became acquainted with an adult prisoner who was serving the last bit of his sentence there. As a maximum security prisoner, he was assigned at Jamesburg as a paraprofessional that assisted in the law library. That adult prisoner was at least known as a member of the Black Panther parties. He learned a lot from that prisoner, and who particularly introduced him to legal research and legal writing, and in beginning to understand civil rights and politics. He also realized that, once again, he was simply being warehoused and systemically not being prepared for life when he would be released. He took advantage of his position in the law library and access to material to look up the New Jersey legislators, so he could complain to them about his situation and not being prepared for when he would be released. He realized that at the time, the New Jersey Senate president was a senator from his hometown of Toms River, New Jersey. He was allowed, wink wink, to use the phone in the law library to call the senator's office. It was a brief call with the senator's secretary, and he left a message about who he was and what his dilemma was. Within about 20 minutes from that phone call, he and the adult prisoner were suddenly summoned to the assistant administrator's office, who simply wanted to know who allowed the phone to be used. The interest and concern was only about who allowed the phone to be used, and nothing about the issue of an incarcerated young man not being prepared to return to the community. Within months, he prepared and filed papers with the court on his own for what was then known as a motion to recall the sentence. In support of that motion, he presented that he had a job at a car dealership detailing cars and had a place to stay. On that basis, the court granted his motion, imposed a term of probation, and right there from the courtroom he was released. He remembers walking out of the courthouse with the two corrections officers, unloading 2 trash bags that contained all of his worldly possessions, and then standing there as they drove away. Once again, he was alone. Despite what was presented to the court and believed, he only had a job, but he didn't have anywhere to live. He had, I believe, not even $50 on him. He was now 18 years old, a chronological adult, but still had no money, nowhere to live, no one to rely on for support, and no idea whatsoever how to support himself and live on his own. It was mid-July and only about a year since he left the shelter, and not much other than the passage of time had changed. Years later, he would realize that there was some very simple, basic information about housing and some other things that could and certainly would have been extremely useful to him and this transition he had an opportunity for, but that no one told him about. But I'll come back to that. For now, he was left to his own devices and did what he knew. He went right back over the bridge to again live on the streets of this Ocean County tourist resort town. That night, he walked off with someone's bicycle so that he could use it to get to work. At work, someone walked off with the bicycle. Within a day or so, he stole a car, which he then used to get to work and actually live in. Within, I think, 2 weeks of his release from Jamesburg, he was arrested for possession of the stolen car. He would then be held in jail because he couldn't afford the bail. An acquaintance from high school would eventually pick up the paycheck and throw in a couple extra dollars to pay his bail a week or so later. When he was released, he was still back at almost the same crossroad that he was at a year earlier and just weeks earlier. He still had no money, nowhere to live, no one to rely on for support, and no idea whatsoever how to support himself and live on his own. The difference now was that he is now in the adult criminal justice system. And his plans to go into the Marine Corps were no longer. Like I alluded to earlier, God had other plans for him. As you may also recall from earlier, where I referred to him as being aimless and confused, there he was again, and continued to be aimless and confused, and with not so much as even a guiding hand. But remember, when he was released from Jamesburg, he was put on probation. He had a probation officer. What, if anything, had the probation officer done or said to him to assist in making the transition from incarceration to the community successful? What that young man did and would continue to do was that man's responsibility, and he would certainly be held accountable for his behavior. But shouldn't a probation officer have done something to assist this young man with some guidance, information, resources? He didn't. Within 2 weeks, he clearly violated probation. The probation officer still did nothing. This troubled young man desperately needed help. Within 7 or 8 months of being released from Jamesburg, he was arrested again. Charged this time with a couple of first-degree armed robberies and some other lesser property crimes. He was again held in jail because he couldn't make bail. Almost a year later of just sitting in jail and no trial or conviction, he managed to get some help with the bail and was simply released. Once again, simply released. And still had no money, nowhere stable to live, no one to rely on for support, and no idea whatsoever how to support himself and live on his own. He would be arrested again within a couple of weeks for another burglary. And he was again held in jail because he couldn't make bail. After over another year of just sitting in jail and no trial or conviction, he managed to get some help with the bail and was simply released. This time the bail was posted by a woman who had worked at the juvenile shelter and detention center since he was 9, who had become even more familiar with him while he was at the detention center when he was 16 and 17 years old, who had on numerous occasions while he was there engaged in sexual contact with him. She was over 20 years older than him. Her purpose in bailing him out was not simply benevolent. Her purpose was the purchase of a sort of boy toy. And under the circumstances, he tried to play along. When she bailed him out, he would stay with her briefly. But as always, nothing for him was stable, healthy, or intended to truly assist him in successfully transitioning back to the community. He would eventually get arrested yet again, and this time for another first-degree armed robbery. Eventually, he was sentenced to serve a term of 16 years in prison. So this cycle of being arrested, held in jail, being released, being arrested, being released, and doing it again repeated itself over and over. And certainly, he is responsible for his conduct. But it should not be of any solace to the victims of his crimes to simply say that he is responsible. Because that oversimplification is not accurate or honest. His history shows and logic dictates that he was created and neglected, some could argue abused, while in the custody and care of our government, taxpayer-funded officials. When we, operating under the idea that we are a civilized society, take custody and control of someone and incapacitate them, we owe it to ourselves, if nobody else, to do what we can to ensure that when we release that person makes a successful transition back into our society and is not a danger to anyone or anyone's property. So when he was sentenced to prison to serve a 16-year term, he was again assigned to work in the law library. During this time, the laws for public assistance, commonly known as welfare, were overhauled federally in 1996. And shortly thereafter, the state of New Jersey also overhauled their welfare laws. Because he worked in the law library, he saw these laws in their entirety when copies made their way to the law library. As you may imagine, he had some time on his hands. So he was able to read and study literally every bit of those laws. As he began to dig into these laws in 1996, it dawned on him that he might be able to use them as a means for the fundamental assistance he would need to make his eventual transition back to the community successful. After all, he was coming up for parole in the next year or so. But it also occurred to him that when he was released from Jamesburg, way back in July of 1988, the welfare system, and particularly as it was in Ocean County, that did not and still does not have a homeless shelter, would have simply put him up in a hotel, provided him with some money for bare necessities, and provided him with food stamps. But nobody told him that when he was released from Jamesburg, particularly not even his probation officer. And what especially dawned on him was this: had he been given that small, simple piece of information, the trajectory of his life that otherwise went straight into our adult criminal justice system within weeks would have certainly been much different. Who knows what exactly that trajectory may have ultimately consisted of and led to, but it certainly would have been much, much different. But now he was in prison, and predominantly because he did not have an adequate parole plan to assist in the successful reintegration to the community, He was denied parole several times. And eventually, he would max out the sentence. His dilemma was similar to thousands of other similarly situated men and women. After all, incarcerated men and women are almost invariably beholden to someone else for assistance to make a successful reintegration to the community. And if that assistance is not provided, what happens? These incarcerated men and women don't get released on parole. They max out. They don't necessarily stay in prison forever. They just eventually finish their sentence and then they are released onto an unsuspecting community without even any supervision or assistance of a parole officer. Nobody. That is illogical, to me at least. How is that even possibly considered a good public policy practice? But in any event, he would max out the sentence in 2002. He served 10 years and 6 months of that 16-year sentence. No probation, no parole, no halfway house, no guiding information, no anything. To ensure that his reintegration to the community would be successful. Just released. A perceived career criminal and a bona fide violent menace to society. Just released onto an unsuspecting and vulnerable community. For all he has been through and is perceived to be, that wasn't a good idea. But he was able to have someone come pick him up. He would be brought to a restaurant for lunch and then to the welfare office. At the restaurant, he subconsciously found a seat where his back was to the wall and he could see the doors. At the table, he sat down to eat in a chair that he particularly noted he could sit in to eat without it being bolted to the floor for the first time in 10.5 years. To eat with, he had a metal fork and a knife. Things he had not touched in 10.5 years. You see, in prison, they issue you a plastic spoon. And you would bring this to the mess hall with you. Oftentimes, you would have it wrapped in a piece of tissue or a paper towel. Because when you were done eating, you would wipe off your spoon and stick it in your pocket. On this afternoon, when he was done eating, he stood up and he wiped off his fork and started to stick it in his pocket. When he realized what he was doing, it was an awkward moment. All of this is to speak to just a couple of many examples of the kind of subconscious psychological conditioning that he and many other similarly situated men and women have had to develop during a period of incarceration, and that remains with them long after their release. From the restaurant, they went to the local welfare office. All went as expected there. He was certainly eligible and would be getting put up in a welfare motel, would be getting some cash assistance, roughly about $100 or so, for basic necessities and also food stamps. There was a little glitch because of the lateness in the day that they might not be able to put him up in a hotel until the next day. But they told him that they were still going to work on it. Just in case the person that gave him the ride asked if there was anyone to call that might let him crash for the night. He thought of one guy he used to hang out with. And the person that gave him the ride handed him a cell phone. Now remember, this was 2002. Cell phones weren't really a thing when he went away 10 and a half years earlier, back in 1992. So he looked at the cell phone. It was one of them little singular phones about this size. And he just looked at it and didn't know how to use it. So the person that gave him the ride took it back and dialed the number and handed it back to him. Then he's holding it up to his ear and it's ringing. And finally there was an answer. He says, "Hey Anthony, it's me." Now there he was, talking into a cell phone like it was an old school walkie-talkie or something, in the middle of a welfare office. It was certainly a humorous moment, to an extent at least, because it was also a somber moment. It exemplified the fact that technology had changed so much over the years. That so much had changed. And that there was a tremendous amount of very new things for him to get to know and become accustomed to. In this basically new world. Now, as it turned out, welfare was able to get him into a hotel that night. And he got a ride over there and he checked into his room. And once again, he was left alone. He remembers laying down around 8 o'clock, just as he would in prison. There goes that prison conditioning again. He remembers watching TV that night, and at some point realizing that it was about 10:30. Without much thought, he simply decided that he would get up and go outside and go for a walk. For no other reason than simply because he could. He had not walked on or near a roadway or been outside that late at night in 10 and a half years. He still remembers to this day the sound, feel, and smell of walking about a mile or so that night. Adjusting was going to take some real effort and patience. Especially as always, he was having to do it all alone. Without any instructions. And without anyone who really knew and understood what he was going through. Who could and would basically hold his hand and guide him through this new experience. In a basically new world. He didn't go out of the hotel much and kept to himself for the most part. But he did become loosely acquainted with some fellow guests at the hotel. A couple of them were international exchange students from Russia. The next thing he knew, he was arrested as a co-defendant of a couple of them. He had been charged with conspiracy to steal and cash checks from the hotel. And he was sent to jail because he couldn't afford the bail. He was beside himself, to say the least. He just got out. Not even 2 months earlier. From having served 10 and a half years. Wasn't really bothering with anyone, kept to himself, certainly wasn't being a criminal. He let his guard down, just a little, let a couple people get too close and acquainted with him. They had him all jammed up in jail with a new case. Thankfully, someone spoke up for him, though. They knew he wasn't a knowing participant in any of that. They helped him get the bail posted after he spent about a week in jail. Ironically, and for reasons he still doesn't know, charges against his so-called co-defendants were dropped within a couple of days, and they were allowed to leave the country. But the charges against him persisted. But out of jail, he still tried to get back to adjusting. And he was doing an okay job at that. He enrolled in community college full-time and volunteered at the college to sort of mentor and talk with the other students that were younger and known to have been formerly incarcerated or court involved, and that might benefit from hearing from him. The new criminal case went on for quite a while. And as it was pending, and especially as each new court date approached, it was constantly and sometimes overwhelming. A reminder that there was a potential he would be convicted and incarcerated again. It was often an unbearable distraction that would instigate his anxiety and depression, all of which he was trying to manage on his own, as always. He would unfortunately begin to engage in criminal activity. He was desperate and committed crime. It became a part of how he tried to manage life again. Just like when he was much younger, he was again aimless and confused, and with no one who knew and understood, and that could pull him away from the edge he seemed to be destined for. He illegally possessed a gun. He stole. He dealt in stolen property. He committed insurance fraud. Nothing necessarily as severe as the armed robberies in the past, but for some of his more current victims, from whom he stole and dealt with their stolen, irreplaceable, precious items, such as jewelry that belonged to a loved one who has passed. His crimes were very serious. He would eventually realize the personal and emotional severity of that, and even to this day is indescribably regretful. At one point, he, for lack of a better phrase, hooked up with an ex-girlfriend. And from that, a child was on the way. The responsibility of the proverbial bed he made for himself was increasingly becoming more and more uncomfortable. He was spiraling out of control. Finally, the child was born. But within 9 months, he was sentenced to what would totally amount to a term of 12 years in prison. The fact of having brought a child into this world and not being there for his child, particularly considering his own childhood, was especially a constant point of pain for him throughout his incarceration. As he had done previously, he would eventually max out the sentence. He was sentenced and served 6 years and 6 months and was again just released. Once again, no probation, no parole, no halfway house, no guiding information, no nothing to ensure that his reintegration to the community would be successful. He was just released. He got released on a Friday night. He had no money and only a pair of sneakers, shorts, socks, boxers, t-shirt, a small bag of some legal paperwork, and a bus pass. He didn't necessarily know where he was going, but he got on a bus to Toms River. Around 10 o'clock at night, he literally showed up at an old acquaintance's apartment and asked if he could crash there for the weekend until he could go to welfare on Monday. He was allowed to stay the night. The next night, he slept on a bench in downtown Toms River. The next night, the mother of his daughter allowed him to stay at her apartment. He slept on the couch. And in the morning, he still remembers hearing his daughter's mother tell their daughter, "Go say hello to your father." He had not seen or spoken with his daughter, but I think only one time in the past 6.5 years. He acted as though he was asleep as she walked up to him. And when his daughter came near to him in the living room, and in her precious 7-year-old voice said, "Hi, Daddy," he will never forget that. That day, he then went to the welfare office. Bureaucratic antics, hurdles, roadblocks, etc., that have grown and festered over the years in this welfare office, that they now called social services, stopped him from getting help, particularly emergency housing assistance. This could have easily resulted in really bad repercussions on someone in the community. But he had developed a sort of mantra that he used to help himself with the stress and burdens of his anxiety and depression that often led him to making bad decisions, that often snowballed into serious problems. He told himself, "Stay patient and focused." Between a mix of couch surfing and sleeping on benches in downtown Toms River for the rest of the week, he maintained a resolve that he was not going to commit any crime. By Friday, the end of that week, he returned to the welfare office, kindly but firmly explained his situation and what had happened on the past Monday. He assured them that one way or the other, he was going to have a roof over his head by the end of the day. That either they were going to help him get one, or the jail was going to put one over his head. And that if it was going to be the jail, he was first going to send a letter to every newspaper he could, explaining his situation and who from social services he has spoken with and that refused to help him get what he was certainly eligible for. Social services quickly managed to figure it out and got him into a welfare hotel by the end of that afternoon. Now, that was almost 9 years ago. Although the immediate circumstances of his release in 2011 were not much different from those in July of 1988, or any of the numerous occasions he was released during that 23-year period. He has not reverted back to committing crime. This is not at all to say that he has not had any entanglements with our criminal justice system. In fact, he has had several. And all of those have been disposed of with outright dismissals or a minimal fine. This is also not to say that he has completely turned his life around and is any sort of success story that is worthy of being praised or congratulated. His story has been and continues to be a constant sort of struggle with many of the issues and realities that constantly exist for similarly situated men and women. In many ways, he practically still wears a mask, behind which he hides the reality of himself and his situation from others. In many other ways, he wears no mask, and boldly but not proudly reveals himself and much of his situation to anyone and everyone. He makes himself that open and vulnerable, usually under one common scenario: when he is advocating for others who are similarly situated, who may not have been as fortunate as he to be able to learn and understand law as much as he has about bureaucracies and politics, or be able to present and articulate and advocate for themselves as well, even when imperfect, as he does. He tries to be a voice for the voiceless. He tries to do for others what he so desperately needed done for him. When he was an innocent child, when he was hurting, confused, an angry young person, when he was alone and desperate, he does all of that and much more. Because looking back on his life and some of the things he has been through and done, and still remains a relatively decent and kind person, he believes it is his purpose in this life to help other similarly situated people. He believes that, although not a religious person, but more of a spiritual person, he has had to confront and accept that the only logical explanation for how he has essentially survived through all the things he has is that there has been some kind of divine intervention and for a purpose much greater than him. You see, I created Project HEURISTIC as the embodiment of my purpose in life. You see, the innocent child, the adolescent, the young adult, the grown man I have been describing to you is me. I thank you again for your generous time and attention. I apologize again for the length of this, but I truly hope that you have gained a much greater appreciation for who I am, what I have been, and continue to try to do, and the extraordinary value in real, adequate, effective, and meaningful assistance for the currently and formerly incarcerated and court-involved men and women. If not for them, for you and your loved ones in our community. I invite you to contact me with any questions or concerns, and especially any interest in helping me build Project Heuristic. Thank you.